Today marks the final message in our series on what it means to be a Christ-centered church. What it means to truly be a reflection of Christ and be made in the image of Christ. And so far we have talked about the fact that Christ was forgiving, that he was authentic, that he was generous and gracious, that he was loving, that he was caring. And now today we're going to look at the fact that Jesus had joy. You know, he was one who was always joyful. He would do things and he would say things to his disciples that would point out the humor that God sees in this world sometimes through our efforts of humanity. You know, we do things and we put all kinds of efforts into things as people, and I'm sure that there are many times that God looks down on us and he just kind of smiles and says, I can't believe that you're going to go down that road again. I just can't believe that you're going to do that after all that I've taught you. And he must have these moments of, even in frustration, just kind of laughing at the folly sometimes that we get ourselves into. And in that, we find God's humor, and Jesus often pointed this out. There are times where he said things that I am sure that the disciples probably cracked up laughing in the midst of, even though they were very serious ways that he was pointing out the deficiencies of the Pharisees and teachers of the law. Because Jesus was a joyful person, and he desired to bring joy into people's lives. And in fact, there are a number of times all throughout Old Testament, New Testament, that God shares this phrase where he says, your joy will be complete. In other words, your joy will be full. It'll be perfect joy. And so we're going to look at what it means for Jesus to have to be joyful, for us to be joyful as models of who Jesus is. I want to start by giving you a story. One of the moments of joy I had in my young life was one year when I was in college. I was preparing for the summer fair circuit. And this one particular summer I had actually saved up enough money that I was going to not just go to our typical local county fair. I wanted to go where there was a little bit more competition. I wanted to go to a new fair that year. And I particularly wanted to go because my top prize animal was all primed this year. She was just in perfect shape. I had it so that she was going to have her calf in June, which means that by the time the fair was there, she was going to be about a month and a half into her new lactation, and that's usually when the cows look absolutely the best. And I thought, I am going to get her prepared, and she is going to go out there and face this big competition, and it's going to win. It's going to be a wonderful thing. And then June rolled around, and she had her calf, and one of the things that sometimes cows can be afflicted with after having a calf is something called milk fever. It is a calcium deficiency in their body, and in fact, it is so bad that if you do not treat the cow right away, she will die within hours. And so we had to go and give her the treatments of calcium in her veins in order to offset the effects of this particular condition. She happened to get a very bad case of it. One of the things that happens when a cow gets milk fever is they can't stand up, and they can't move around and that kind of thing. We ended up having to put about 4 different bottles of calcium into her before it actually took effect and she was well. Well, the only problem was that during the calving she also pinched a nerve, and it made it difficult for her to stand up. And so it took almost an entire week before this cow stood up. And in fact, a few days before she stood up, my dad was telling me in very soft and gentle ways, we might have to actually shoot this cow, this cow might possibly die here. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, this is my prize baby. I got her primed. This is the year. I can't let her die. And we kind of sit there, and every day I would, after chores, and I would try to get this cow up, and I would try to nurse her to health and everything. Finally, after a week, she stood up. But then she had a limp, and she couldn't walk very well, and she had a scar on her side from where she rubbed herself against the boards in the pen trying to get up, and she was just in really bad shape. And we kind of kept nursing her to health and so forth. They got to be the time that we have to do some vet work. In New York State, you can't take any animal to a fair unless you've had the vet come, give them a bunch of shots of different things and test their blood and all that kind of stuff. And so there's a day when you have to do that beforehand. And I had come to that day, and she was still not really well. She was still limping around pretty badly. She wasn't in very good shape. And I thought, oh man, this is going to be a terrible, terrible experience. I can't take my prize cow. And that day we came to, the vet was going to come. I let all the animals out that we weren't taking to the fair, kept the ones in that we were going to. I got to my favorite prize cow, and I unhooked her and said, it's time to go out early. You're not going to be able to go this year. And I went and unhooked all the rest of the animals, started chasing them out the barn. I came back down through the barn, and there sat the cow still standing in the stall. And I said, you can't go. You know, normally she'd just get out and go, but she stayed right there. And I tried moving her out. She wouldn't move anywhere. I said, okay, fine. I will test you, and we'll get you tested for the fair just in case. And so we did. I let her get tested the whole 9 yards. A little month goes by. All of a sudden, she's starting to walk a little better, and she's starting to feel a little better. And I thought, well, maybe there's still a chance. Maybe I'll still take her anyway. And I loaded her up on the truck, and we took her to the fair. Got her off the truck, and of course, as you're getting them there, I'm sitting there thinking, I'm looking at everybody else's animals, oh man, she's still skinny, she doesn't look real great right now. Maybe a week at the fair of babying and stuff, she'll look better. And I was looking around the different competition that was there, and across from us, in the string just on the other side of the barn, there was all of these animals that had been brought from Pennsylvania, and they looked absolutely fabulous. And these people had done it for years, and they were the people that had the money to do it and so forth, and they had all the top animals. And I thought, oh man, I don't have a chance against these. And then I went to the other barn, and I found in the other barn people that had gone to the state fair for many years, and I found another, in that lineup there was a veterinarian who was tied in, and he had 2 daughters. And one of the daughters had this cow that was second place at the state fair the year before, which is a big deal in New York State. It's a big competition, big fair. Well, this daughter had a reputation that I found out about. This is the first time I ever been to the county fair. I didn't really know anybody there. But they all told me that they had a nickname for her. It was Prissy Missy. So you can imagine what kind of person. She would actually, there was a stack of bales of hay that would be right next to the show ring where everybody could see. And she would sit up there almost daily, filing her nails and primping herself and doing all this kind of thing. And I suddenly figured out why they called her Prissy Missy. And she was used to winning there every year. I found out that she had won with her animal there for like the last 3 or 4 years in a row. And as I'm sitting there thinking, oh man, I just don't stand a chance. I kept looking at my cow. Well, you know, the weeks started to go on, and after bathing a little bit, you watch her started to transform, and there was a guy there who had kind of latched on to us. He saw that we were new, and he kind of came and he'd sit there and look at things and stuff. And by the end of the week, he came up to us and he says, you know what? Your cow's starting to look really good. He says, maybe if you do a few things that I can show you, maybe you'll have a chance. And so we were fairly new into the business. I was used to standing at the bottom of the classes for many, many years with my Holstein cows, and I couldn't get big enough, and so I switched over to the Jerseys because they're nice and small. I didn't have to get super big. I thought, oh, get into the competition, and I didn't know anything, though. So I took this guy's advice, and we did a few things to fix her up and all that kind of stuff. Show day comes. In the morning, I get out there, and this cow stands up for the first time, and she is just full of milk, and she looks really good and stuff. And I was like, wow, I think we might have a shot. And the guy that was there, he comes over, he says, I think we might have a shot. We came out into the class, and the class that I was in happened to be in the same class as Prissy Missy and her cow. And I'm sitting there leading that cow around the ring, and I'm just shaking like a leaf. And the cow's probably wondering, what is wrong with you? And I'm just watching the judge and watching him look over, and he's looking back and forth between my cow and Prissy Missy cow, and he's just going back and forth like this, and he has them stand next to each other, and he examines them really close and all this kind of thing. And after what seemed like an eternity of deliberation, he finally pats my cow on the back and sends her up into the first place in the class. And I thought to myself, oh, this is awesome. And I got there and won that class. And then we had to come out later for the champion class, which was when you compete against all the winners of all the various classes. And then those people that were across from us were in that class. And I thought to myself, oh man, got out of one hurdle, now I got to get by the other hurdle. And again, I'm shaking like a leaf as I'm walking that cow around the ring. And finally, the judge, after looking at all of them, goes over to the microphone to give his reasons. And he asked me to pull out my cow into the place for grand champion. And I was on top of the world. It was an amazing moment of joy, and I went out of that ring there, and the old gentleman who had latched onto us, he came up to me and he said, somebody's going to be crying tonight. And he was all excited because it was an inside thing. And it was just a moment of euphoria. As I think about that and how much joy I got out of that, I realized the joy wasn't necessarily just in the winning. Because joy comes from several different places. It is not just something that's there about winning. It is about the overcoming. It is about the enduring. It is about a whole host of other things. And Jesus knew this, and he understood this, and he was teaching his disciples during this time when he was about to go to the cross. Now think about this. This is amazing that Jesus here, as he's knowing that what's to come about his betrayal and his death on the cross, the thing that comes to his mind is joy. In the midst of all that, he's able to teach his disciples about joy. I want to read to you a section of John chapter 15. There, in the midst of this little Olivet discourse, he says this to his disciples: I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me, and I will remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If a man remains in me and I in him, he will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If anyone does not remain in me, he is like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be given you. This is to my Father's glory, that you may bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Now remain in my love. If you obey my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have obeyed my Father's commands and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends, for everything that I learned from my Father I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you, and appointed you to go and bear fruit, fruit that will last. Then the Father will give you whatever you ask in my name. This is my command: love each other. I find that in this particular passage, Jesus tells us three things that are important to know about joy. The first thing that he tells us is that joy comes from bearing fruit. Joy comes from bearing fruit. Our main mission as believers in Jesus Christ is to make other disciples, to bring people who do not know Christ, who do not have a relationship with Christ, into fellowship with him. That is the fruit that we as Christians bear. And it is in that fruit and seeing that fruit that we get joy. The Old Testament is full of sort of these agricultural stories. It doesn't tell any stories like my story of my show cow, but it tells us stories about how they went through this process every year of planting and harvesting, planting and harvesting. And in the midst of that, God gives them 3 festivals that they are to celebrate every year. And they are to be week-long festivals. They're supposed to be times of joy. In fact, he commands them, you are to be joyful during these weeks. And it's interesting, every one of those celebrations that were given to the people in the Old Testament surrounded the times of harvest. They surrounded the times of bearing fruit. And each of those moments, they celebrated the bearing of fruit. In the New Testament, God tells us, Luke chapter 15, when he's talking about the story of the lost sheep and the lost coin and the prodigal son, he makes the statement, he says, there is more rejoicing in heaven over one lost soul that comes to Jesus Christ than there is over 99 sheep that are still in the fold. There's rejoicing when there's a harvest. There's a rejoicing when there is fruit bearing. You know, that time I won with my cow, the winning was actually the harvest. It was all the stuff before that that really led to the rejoicing. I knew all the backstory. I knew what that animal endured physically. I knew where I had stood for years and years in those show rings. I knew all of the things that were involved in trying to nurse that animal back to health and do everything to get her to that place where there was fruit. And when we have those moments of fruit bearing, we realize there was a whole lot that went into it beforehand, and that's what really gives us the joy. Because it made all that work and that enduring and facing the obstacles and so forth was all worth it. The same thing is true if you think about the fruit of seeing lives come to Christ. There's a whole lot of prayer, time on your knees that is spent trying to bring that person to a place of decision. We have to trust in the work of the Holy Spirit to change that person's heart, and that begins when we get on our knees and pray for them. And there's a lot of work in prayer. It is not something that is just sort of this thing that we say, we're going to get together for prayer. Isn't everybody happy? Usually it's more of prayer as work. It's blood and sweat and tears. And then there are the moments that we have those conversations, and sometimes we think the conversations go well, and sometimes the conversations don't seem to go well. And sometimes there's a little bit of glimmer of hope that maybe that person will come to Christ, and then it kind of fades over time in different times. And there's this constant struggle that's going from the moment that we begin our prayer for that person to the moment that they actually come to Christ. But when they do come to Christ, we look back on all that stuff and we say, this was worth it. This is where the joy comes from. This is why we can have joy. It's in bearing much fruit. But too often, we're like a lot of the way the world has gone. We want the fruit without the work. You know, a fruit without work isn't as joyful. I mean, think about it. Think about everything that you've ever experienced joy from, true joy that was lasting joy. It was always something that was preceded by work and obstacles and all kinds of overcoming. Until you got to that place and you realized this is where the joy is. This was what was all worth it. But when we have things that are just simply given to us, fruit that's just given to us without the work beforehand, it's just happiness and it's temporary. It doesn't last. It comes in fruitfulness. Joy is found in fruitfulness. Joy is also found in obedience. Jesus tells his disciples here, if you obey my words, if you remain in me through obedience, obedience is your sign that you really truly love me. And in obedience, you will find great joy. I am so amazed, and I'm sure that others are amazed as they look at people in this world that will chase after all kinds of dreams, or will fall into all kinds of addictions, or will fall into all kinds of broken relationships trying to find the perfect one. And they'll go through all of that process over and over again, thinking it's going to bring them joy. All the while, it is outside of the realms of obedience to God. And it's really cool to watch a person come to Christ, because a lot of times a person who comes to Christ looks at all the things that were these things that they had to do to obey God, and they thought at first were so handcuffing. And then they come to Christ and they realize that in obedience to Christ there's freedom. You know, I can go out and celebrate, and I can have a party, and there's no hangover. I can go out and I can make relationships with people, and there's no brokenness afterwards. I can go out and I can do things that are within the desire of God's will. And He doesn't add the things to it that are the consequences that I have to deal with later, that are so bad and sorrowful and depressing. We find joy when we're obedient. We find joy when we're walking in the path that God wants us to. We're doing the things that He desires for us to do. Joy is also found in loving others. Jesus says here very clearly that when you truly know how to love that other person, when you know how to love a brother from the heart, when you know how to love a person in such a way that you'd be willing to lay down your life for them, there's joy in that. There's joy in acts of kindness. You know, we did a whole thing on studying that book, Acts of Kindness and Conspiracy of Kindness, and we were talking about measuring those acts of kindness as ways of really looking to make an impact in people's lives. I remember when we started that out, everybody's just like, oh my goodness, why are we going to keep track of this? And why are we going to, this is just all about ourselves and different things like that. Let me tell you, when you do things that are true, genuine acts of kindness in another person's life and you demonstrate love in that way, there is so much joy to be had in that. It's amazing that we would simply look at the figures and the keeping of figures on it as a reason not to do it. And yet that's what we're called to do. The fruit of changed lives comes when we start by loving people. When we do acts of kindness for them, when we get creative with it. We can be creative with our acts of kindness. We can do things that just come to our mind that are brand new, and we can think about that's a way that we can reach into that person's heart. I still remember that Christmas that my mother made all those Christmas trays, and we went and we dropped them off secretly to people's homes. We were warned in a very stern way. You're not to tell anybody anything about this, even if they ask you. You say you don't know nothing about it. And I can remember one of those families in particular sharing the story about how they had found a whole plate of cookies in wherever it was that they found it, that we left it, and how much joy it had brought, and they got emotional about it and that kind of thing. And I thought to myself, this is awesome. I know who did that. And I can't share a thing about it, but it's still awesome. Because we have a certain amount of joy that comes in being able to love people in creative and kind ways like that. And it also comes when we love the person who is sometimes seen by others as unlovable. You know, every one of us walks around with a certain amount of insecurity. Even the most successful people in the world will tell you that one of the struggles that they have in life is feeling confident about who they are. Everybody struggles with that. And there are some that probably struggle with it more because so many people have pointed out their flaws. So many people have pointed out or picked on certain things. Boy, when you can come alongside and love somebody like that and really demonstrate the love of Christ in that way, it can really change that person's life. It can change the trajectory of their life. I heard the story of a guy that had cerebral palsy, born that way, and had all kinds of things to have to endure, as well as the picking on from other people and all of that kind of thing. And when he shares his testimony of faith, and how he was led to Christ, he points out this one teacher that he had. One teacher who in his elementary days believed that he could do anything. And he went on and on talking about this one teacher who loved him when nobody else would. Imagine the joy of that teacher hearing that testimony. Imagine the joy that's there because this person who thought that they didn't have value, that they weren't loved, really felt somebody loved them. There's joy in that. There is joy in loving sacrifice. A lesson I learned the hard way as a young kid. I went to camp, and in the camp they used to have these little snack cards that you could use at the snack stand. Your parents would pay about $5 at the beginning of the week or whatever. That's what it was back in my day. It probably have to be about 20 now. For kids in this day. But we had things that we could buy at the snack shop for like a penny or 5 cents or things like that. And I remember them also sharing with us at the beginning of the week that if we saved up a certain amount of money on our snack cards, we could actually donate it to missions, and it would go into counting towards our team competitions. And I thought to myself at the beginning of the week, I am going to save as much as I can on this card. And I am going to be able to donate this money to missions, and it's going to help my team to win. As we're going through the week, I would stop at the snack shack in the afternoon, and I would kind of sit there and say, well, let's see, I want to go to something that's only 25 cents today. And I would spare it and so forth. And about Wednesday, I think it was, somewhere in the middle of the week, I noticed that there was this kid that was in our group that didn't have a snack card. He was one of those kids that looked like he was probably came from a home of poverty, and he didn't look like he was as well-to-do and so forth, and he didn't have a snack card. While everybody else was there at the snack stand getting stuff, he was just kind of having to stand over by the side of the counselor. And one day I got this bright idea. I'm gonna buy this kid a snack. But I had to do this little juggling in my mind. On the one hand, I was sitting there thinking, I really got a big amount here. I want to make sure this goes to missions so our team can win. And then on the other hand, I'm thinking, like, this kid would really appreciate something. So I made up a compromise in my mind. And I went to this kid and I said, I'll buy you anything in the snack shack that's under 5 cents. And he bought these few little skinny little Twizzler type things that they had, this big long licorice stuff that was there, and you could get so much of it for 5 cents or something like that. And he bought that. And then I remember thinking the rest of that week, and obviously I remembered it even to this day. I'm sitting there thinking to myself, if I was truly going to sacrificially love this kid, I would have simply gone to him and said, you pick whatever you want there. You get whatever you want. I will buy you a snack for the rest of the week. That would have been the loving thing to do. That would have been the thing that probably would have brought greater joy. You know, instead, because I was disobedient in that moment, I have felt guilty about that moment ever since then. And I have lacked joy as a result. Because joy comes in loving other people, in loving on other people. We got a kid, I'm hoping he's going to come to church here. He's coming to school here at Iowa this fall. His name is Tyler York. Tyler's a special kid. Tyler's one of those kids that I'm sure got picked on in school. He talks funny. He's kind of a nerdy sort of kid. He's not the kid that you think of with everybody around him, but Tyler's got a big heart, and Tyler's a really cool kid. One day, several years ago, we were on one of our quizzing trips to Milton, which is where he's from. And we were there, and I had found that, actually it was a trip to Cyprus, I should say. Cyprus and Columbus, Ohio. And I had this special place where I always slept when I went to Cyprus. Nobody else was there in this room. Nobody else, it was a secret room that I had. Well, one year, Tyler and his buddies found my secret place, and they camped out there, and they brought all their stuff in and stuff. And I came out, and I was just like, who took their stuff and put it in my special place? And Tyler, he came out, and he was like, we did. He was real proud of it. And he got on me the whole rest of the time we were there. We stole your place, Pastor Matt. And so Tyler and I started this back and forth thing. And one of the things I found out early on is there's one of the competitions where we pause in the middle of the competition. And we pause for a minute. And it usually gets really quiet and stuff. And we were there one of the times, and Tyler says, I really hate this. And from that moment on, I had this bright idea. Every time we had that moment of silence, I was going to say, this moment of awkward silence is brought to you by Tyler York. And it was so funny because it's something that just sort of caught on. And so I started to do it every time and so forth. And now everybody at Quizzing knows that when we take that moment of awkward silence, it's all because of Tyler. And Tyler loves it. And Tyler just eats it up every time now. When you make this statement, he's like, yeah, I'll be here all week, and things like that. And he just absolutely loves it. And I really feel like it brings me a certain amount of joy because I can see Tyler having been one of those kids that got lost in the cracks somewhere. I see that he could have been one of those kids that maybe had that bad experience the first time he came to Bible Bowl and never came back. And it just brings me joy to see that he is excited about it and he's made friends there. And because of that, in fact, he's sort of been highlighted so that other kids are actually going to him and wanting to be around him. It was something that probably changed a little bit of his life, I would hope. That's what happens when we love on people. When we love on them and we really demonstrate to them what it is that God wants to do with life and that God cares about them, it can bring us joy. It can bring us joy not only because of the joy we have in loving that person, but it's an obedience to God in our loving other people. It's also a way that fruit is produced. And fruit producing brings us joy. So my question that I would ask you today is, where is your joy? Do you have the joy of the Lord? As they said in the book of Nehemiah, the joy of the Lord is our strength. That's where our strength comes from as Christians, is that we have joy that's overwhelming our lives. So how is your joy today? Do you have joy in your fruitfulness? Is there fruitfulness in your life that you can point to that you say, this is my joy? Is there obedience? Are you living in the center of God's will and you sense the joy that's there because you're living right in the middle of where God wants you? Is there joy because you have loved on other people well? You've helped change the lives of others. That's where joy is. And I believe that so many Christians today lack the joy of Jesus in their heart. Because they've become so selfish and so inward and so much about their own preferences and their own little world that they've lost the joy that there is in producing fruit by loving others and being obedient to God. There's real joy to be had there. Maybe if we've gotten off track, we need to find ourselves back to that place of doing those three things. Of being involved in that way. And that would give us joy. Joy that the world can see. You know, one of the things that people are desperate for today in our world is some people who just simply have joy. Who are content people, who are happy people with their lives. Because they know they're living it out in the center of God's will. That is attractive to the world. That is attractive to people who need to know Christ. We need more joy in the church, in Christians. If we're going to have an impact on this world and make a difference in it. Where is your joy? Do you have joy? Do you have that relationship with Christ that brings joy? Are you being fruitful, loving of others, being obedient? Find the joy that God wants you to have. Let's pray together.